The title of my research is How Term Limits Change the Presidency. Why study the presidency and term limits? I did this to examine the presidencies before term limits and to examine how term limits affected each president. The creation of presidents. So in 1789, Congress began requiring states to select electors for the country's first president. And shortly after, George Washington was elected as president and sworn into office in April of 1789. After George Washington was elected, we see that there were a lack of term limits, and this is mainly because presidents were intended to serve however many terms they could win. So there were no term limits under the Articles of Confederation solely because there was no discussion of a president. And the framers intentionally did not mention a head of state because they were hesitant when it came to creating something similar to a king, such as George III. In the end, the framers' creation of the president ended up being very similar to a king for a couple of reasons. One being the framers granted the president presidential pardons, which were very similar to the British king's royal prerogative of mercy. Another reason as to why the president looked similar to a king is because the framers were going to allow each president to serve for the rest of their lives. And the last reason is because framers originally intended for presidents to be chosen by Congress and not by the people, which would have completely defeated the purpose of the United States being a democracy. So now I'm going to speak about the unofficial term limits. So there were no official term limits, but most of the presidents only served for 2 term limits without even running for a third. And this is mainly because our first president, Washington, declined to run for a third term just because he did not feel like it was needed. And then our third president, Jefferson, only served for 2 terms because he believed that 2 terms was adequate for one person. After this, several presidents followed in their footsteps and only served for 2 terms without even attempting to run for a third. The universe of the study. The universe of the study is to examine presidents through 1 through 32, and those are the presidents who did not have set term limits. And then I examined presidents 33 through 45 who did have official term limits. My research is done between the years of 1789 until 2020. The test of the hypothesis. So in my research and in my literature review, I discussed the intent of presidents and how long a president would serve and how long they should serve. And then I also mentioned FDR's presidency and the creation of the 22nd Amendment. And then I go into detail about how the presidency has changed since the 22nd Amendment. So some of my theories in my paper that I discuss in further detail is why presidential terms did not exist until FDR died and why the constitutional framers decided to not mention term limits. I also talk about the unspoken rule of only serving 2 terms and why that was and why it was followed and why in some cases it wasn't followed. And then I also talk about how natural it seemed for FDR to stay in office because he was so well liked, and how that could lead to other presidents continue to stay in office for maybe the rest of their lives. And then I also talk about how once FDR died, lawmakers decided to then start to argue the necessity of term limits in order to prevent an abuse of power. So FDR. FDR was the first president to serve a 3rd term and some of a 4th term. FDR was well liked by the American people and gave them hope during the Great Depression. The United States was on the brink of social, economic, and political disaster, and FDR was able to lay the foundation for future stability and prosperity. Continuing about FDR, it should be mentioned that FDR was not liked by everyone. Even though he was well liked, not everyone agreed that FDR should have ran for a third term, and that he was given much backlash for running for a third term. Once he decided to run for a third term, key Democratic advisors and supporters left FDR's campaign just because they were not in agreement of this. Many business people in America believe that FDR was taking America down the road of socialism and voted against him. The creation of term limits was brought up in 1944 by FDR's opponent in the presidential election, and he said that 4 terms or 16 years is the most dangerous threat to our freedom ever proposed. Although this statement was very true back then and is true right now, it did not change the outcome of that election because he was reelected. Now I'm going to speak about the 22nd Amendment. So FDR died during his 4th term, and right after he died, the ratification of the 22nd Amendment began. The 22nd Amendment says that no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once. So the effective term limits, for many presidents, term limits did not affect them. This is mainly because most presidents after FDR were either too tired and worn out to serve a third term, or some were simply not well liked and would not have been elected a third term even if they attempted to. Many people believe that the only 2 presidents who may have had a chance of running for a third term and succeeded were Clinton and Obama. This is mainly because they were well liked and respected and fairly young when they left office. Now I'm going to mention Grover Cleveland, which something to mention about term limits is that a president could serve for 1 term, leave for whatever reason, and then return and then run again for the presidency whenever down the road. So the one president who succeeded in doing this was our 22nd and 24th president, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland lost the 1888 election, which would have been his 2nd term, but did not give up and ran again in the 1892 and won the election. So with this being said, you can only run and be president, or you can only serve as president for 2 terms, but those 2 terms do not have to be back to back. Here I have listed presidents who were not affected by the term limits, and I have Dwight Eisenhower, JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush. And the reasons as to why these presidents were not affected by term limits range from them either not being very popular, to them being older or tired, to them dying in office, and to them just not being well liked. So first we have Dwight Eisenhower, who served for 2 terms, but probably would not have attempted to run for a 3rd term simply because of old age, and he didn't seem as if he wanted to be in office anymore. Then we have JFK, who was assassinated while in office. And then we have Lyndon B. Johnson, who didn't have the best presidency, and this is because of the Vietnam War and the civil unrest, which separated the nation. Then there's Richard Nixon, who resigned during his 2nd term because he was going to be impeached and because of the Watergate scandal. Next, we have Gerald Ford, who lost his re-election to Jimmy Carter, then Jimmy Carter, who lost his re-election to Ronald Reagan, and then we have Ronald Reagan, who for the same reason as Eisenhower, because of old age and being tired, and also because of the Iran-Contra scandal. Lastly, there's George Bush, who lost his re-election to Bill Clinton. These next few slides is just a chart of all the presidents and the number of terms they were elected, the presidents who attempted to serve more than 2 terms, and the presidents who died or were killed in office. So you can read this. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the importance of presidential term limits in our political system. So, presidential term limits strengthen the democratic institutions and they help ensure the peaceful political transition. They push leaders to make the changes or keep promises made during the elections and to deliver results. This point just mainly goes into presidents making promises during their elections and during their campaigns. And if a president were to be able to be president for the rest of their lifetime, it's really unlikely that that president would actually take steps into making the change that they promised because they're safe, they're in office, and nobody could oppose them once they're already in. Another importance of the presidential term limit is to ensure that political leaders do not become indispensable and to avoid looking like a king or a dictator, which is very important because we do have a democracy. Presidential term limits also prevent presidents from staying in leadership for too long, even if they're popular or loved, and they stimulate healthy competition needed to improve democratic institutions and processes. Some of my findings and conclusion, many presidents acted as if there were term limits before there were actually term limits, and only 3 presidents attempted to run for a third term. Term limits are very important since we live in a democracy, and in order for people to feel as if they're being heard, they must have a voice when it comes to deciding a leader. With social media and TV, presidents have much more coverage than they had ever before. And with this coverage, it means a lower approval rating, and that means less chances to be elected for even a second term, let alone a third term. So, in my summary, before term limits, many presidents already acted as if there were term limits, and term limits were much needed in our country just because a president could have possibly started to feel like a dictator or a king. It is important to note that there were many attempts seeking to implement term limits before the 22nd Amendment and before FDR, but those attempts were not adopted. Term limits definitely changed the course of the presidencies, even though in my research it did prove that many presidents who served after the 22nd Amendment probably would have retired. There's no way of knowing that that is certain. But the 22nd Amendment has stopped that from even happening, or that stopped that from possibly happening, and it's definitely changed the course of the presidency for good. This is my work cited, and that is the end of my research paper and my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed.